Dakota Territory, 1899. While his neighbors threw up standard log cabins with light pine walls, Lars Anderson was doing something that made the town carpenter call him a fool. He was deliberately burning one entire wall of his 14 by 18-foot cabin. Not an accident, a careful, controlled char across every log on the south face. 6 hours with a pine knot torch, turning good timber black as coal. The established builder warned everyone that scorched wood invites fire and ruins structural integrity. Neighbors couldn't believe he was wasting half a day's fuel just to blacken perfectly sound logs. They called it dangerous. They called it wasteful. Then February arrived. The great cold snap of 1899 drove temperatures to 30 below, with winds that turned every gap into a knife blade. Standard cabins struggled, ice formed on interior walls, families burned through their wood reserves, children developed that hard, wet cough that meant real trouble. But that burned cabin? When the school teacher measured both homes with identical thermometers at dawn, Lars's cabin read 59 degrees while his neighbors barely reached 38. 21 degrees warmer, the difference between sleeping comfortably and fighting hypothermia all night. What did this Scandinavian immigrant understand about sunlight, heat absorption, and thermal mass that an entire frontier community had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. Dakota Territory, autumn 1898. The first cold snap had arrived early, sending most settlers scrambling to bank their cabins with extra sod and patch gaps in their log walls before winter settled in permanently. Lars Anderson stood in his cabin doorway at dawn, studying the south-facing wall of his 14 by 18-foot home with the calculating eye of a man who had survived enough harsh winters to know that conventional wisdom sometimes killed people. The logs were good pine, scribed tight and chinked properly, but like every other cabin in the township, they had been left their natural pale color, clean, respectable timber that reflected the weak autumn sun back toward the prairie without capturing any of its heat. His neighbors had already started the familiar ritual of splitting and stacking extra cordwood, adding to piles that would need to last until March if the winter proved as brutal as the sign suggested. The town carpenter, Samuel Wright, had been making his rounds through the district, advising homesteaders to lay in at least 5 cords per family and keep their stoves burning steady through the coldest months. Wright preached the gospel of frontier heating that every settler learned by necessity. Heat came from fuel, and fuel came from labor. Cut more wood, burn it hotter, tend the fire more often. That was the mathematics of survival on the northern plains. Lars had different ideas. During his first winter in America, he had watched families burn through expensive cordwood while still fighting frost inside their cabins, and he remembered techniques from the old country that treated sunlight like another building material. In Norway, builders oriented structures to catch and hold whatever heat the weak northern sun provided, understanding that winter was not just about burning fuel, but about harvesting whatever free energy the environment offered. The trick was making that energy work for you instead of simply reflecting it back to the sky. The method he had in mind would look like disaster to anyone who did not understand the principle. He spent the morning clearing a wide area around the south wall, raking away dry grass and wood chips until he had a fire-safe zone extending 10 feet from the cabin. He filled 2 water buckets from the creek and soaked a gunny sack until it dripped. The preparation looked excessive to neighbors who noticed his activity, but Lars had learned that controlled fire required the same discipline as any other dangerous tool. One mistake could reduce 18 months of labor to ash and leave his family exposed to winter with nothing. The actual work began with a pine knot torch and a short-handled shovel, tools that allowed him to control flame and scrape away excess char as he worked. He started at the bottom corner of the south wall and moved systematically across each log, holding the flame close enough to blacken the wood surface, but not long enough to ignite the timber itself. The technique required patience. Too little heat left the wood unchanged, while too much could start a fire that would consume the entire cabin. He worked log by log, charring the face evenly until the entire south wall had been transformed from pale pine to deep black carbon. The physical work took most of the day, 6 hours of careful flame control that left his arms aching and his clothes heavy with soot. Neighbors passing by offered comments that ranged from curious to openly hostile. Samuel Wright stopped his wagon to stare at the blackened wall and shook his head with the disgust of a craftsman watching good materials being ruined. "You ought to finish burning the rest so it matches," he called out, loud enough for other settlers to hear the joke. The laughter that followed carried the edge that frontier communities reserved for behavior that threatened group survival through individual foolishness. After the charring was complete, Lars brushed away loose soot with a stiff broom and began the final step that would determine whether the technique succeeded or failed. He rubbed the blackened surface with tallow rendered from the beef he had butchered the month before, working the fat into the charred wood until the wall gleamed with a dark, water-resistant finish. The tallow would prevent rain from washing away the carbon layer during the spring thaw, preserving the surface that would absorb solar energy throughout the winter months. By evening, the south wall of his cabin looked like the aftermath of a fire that had somehow spared the rest of the structure. The contrast with his neighbor's clean, pale timber was stark enough to draw comments from anyone passing on the main trail. Children pointed and whispered. Women shook their heads at the waste of good wood. Men predicted that the scorched logs would rot faster and invite insects, creating problems that would outlast whatever temporary advantage the blackened surface might provide. The work had cost him half a day of labor, and the equivalent of an evening's firewood burned in controlled flames instead of his stove. By frontier standards, it represented a significant expenditure of time and fuel for a result that looked more like damage than improvement. As the first stars appeared over the prairie, Lars stood back to examine his work. Tomorrow would bring the first test, whether the blackened wall could absorb enough solar energy to make a measurable difference in the cabin's interior temperature, or whether Samuel Wright and the other skeptics were correct in their assessment that he had simply ruined a perfectly good wall for nothing. The morning sun broke clear and sharp across the Dakota prairie, casting long shadows that stretched westward from every cabin and fence post in the township. Lars Anderson stepped outside before full dawn to check his thermometer, a simple spirit instrument he kept mounted on the north wall away from direct sunlight. The mercury read 10 degrees above zero, cold enough to make breath visible but mild compared to what February would bring. Most settlers would consider it a decent day for outdoor work, the kind of weather that let a man split wood without his axe handle numbing his hands after 20 minutes. The charred south wall of his cabin absorbed the first rays of sunlight like black cloth soaking up water. Within an hour of sunrise, the surface temperature had climbed enough that Lars could feel warmth radiating from the logs when he held his palm 6 inches away. The contrast with his untreated east and west walls was immediate and measurable. Those surfaces remained cold to the touch, even in direct sunlight, reflecting solar energy back toward the sky instead of converting it to heat that could warm his living space. The mechanism was simple physics that any blacksmith understood intuitively. Light-colored surfaces bounced sunlight away, while dark surfaces absorbed it, transforming radiant energy into thermal energy that warmed the material itself. What made the technique work on a cabin wall was the thermal mass of the logs themselves, 9 to 12-inch diameter pine timber that could store significant amounts of heat and release it gradually over time. The thick log construction that frontier builders used for structural strength also functioned as an accidental heat battery, holding warmth absorbed during sunny hours and radiating it back into the cabin after sunset. By midday, with the sun riding its low winter arc across the southern sky, the blackened wall surface registered temperatures that would have seemed impossible to anyone who had not witnessed the effect directly. Lars pressed his bare palm against the charred logs and counted slowly to 10, feeling heat that approached the warmth of a banked stove. The same test applied to his neighbor Samuel Wright's cabin wall. Pale pine logs of identical dimensions oriented in the same direction yielded only the cold touch of wood that might have been stored in a root cellar. Inside the cabin, the difference translated to measurable comfort that reduced his dependence on cordwood for the first time since arriving in Dakota Territory. His usual morning routine involved building up the fire in his cast iron stove, feeding it armloads of split wood, and waiting for the interior temperature to climb from the overnight low to something approaching livable. On this clear day following the wall treatment, the indoor thermometer showed a steady climb that began earlier and required less fuel to maintain. The evening test provided the most convincing proof that the technique offered genuine value beyond novelty. As sunset approached and the outside temperature began its nightly drop, the south wall continued radiating stored heat into the cabin interior. Lars could stand with his back against the logs and feel warmth penetrating through his wool shirt, a sensation entirely absent from the untreated walls that had already begun conducting cold from the exterior. The thermal lag meant that solar energy collected during the day continued heating his living space for hours after the sun disappeared below the western horizon. His daily wood consumption dropped by approximately 1 armload, a reduction of 15 to 20 pounds of fuel that represented genuine savings over the course of a long winter. More importantly, the steady background heat from the wall allowed him to set his stove damper lower 30 to 45 minutes earlier each evening, extending the time between required stoking and reducing the labor of maintaining comfort through the night. These were incremental improvements that added up to meaningful differences in both fuel consumption and sleep quality during the coldest months. The practical benefits became obvious to anyone who spent time inside the cabin, but the visual impact of the blackened wall continued to provoke negative reactions from neighbors who judged the technique by appearance rather than performance. Samuel Wright stopped by 3 days after the charring to examine the work more closely, running his hands along the treated surface and shaking his head at what he considered damage masquerading as improvement. The tallow finish had given the charred logs a dark sheen that caught sunlight differently than natural wood, creating an effect that Wright described as looking like the aftermath of a controlled burn that had gotten slightly out of hand. The social pressure against the technique intensified as word spread through the township that Lars Andersen had deliberately scorched one wall of his cabin in pursuit of some Norwegian folk remedy for cold weather. Frontier communities developed strong opinions about building practices because individual failures could burden the entire district. A family that lost their cabin to fire or structural collapse became everyone's responsibility through the harsh winter months. Experimental techniques that deviated from proven methods were viewed with suspicion that went beyond mere conservatism to genuine concern about collective survival. Martha Henderson, the school teacher who kept detailed weather records and maintained correspondence with relatives back east, agreed to document the temperature differences using identical thermometers placed at the same height in both Lars's cabin and Wright's nearby structure. Her motivation was curiosity rather than advocacy. She wanted measurements that could settle the argument with data instead of opinion. Henderson represented the kind of frontier resident who trusted instruments over intuition and maintained skepticism about folk remedies while remaining open to evidence that contradicted conventional assumptions. The preliminary results confirmed what Lars had experienced subjectively but needed to prove objectively. During clear, sunny days when the charred wall could absorb maximum solar energy, his cabin maintained interior temperatures 6 to 10 degrees higher than comparable structures using identical heating methods. The advantage was most pronounced during the afternoon and evening hours when stored heat continued warming his living space, while conventionally built cabins began their nightly slide toward uncomfortable cold. Critics acknowledged the measured temperature differences but dismissed them as temporary benefits that would disappear once serious winter weather arrived with sustained cloud cover and wind that could drive cold through any wall regardless of color. Samuel Wright predicted that the technique would prove worthless during extended periods without sunshine, when the blackened surface would offer no advantage over conventional log construction, while presenting ongoing maintenance problems and fire risks that would ultimately outweigh any marginal heating benefits. The real test, Wright insisted, would come when the weather turned genuinely dangerous, and survival depended on proven methods rather than experimental modifications to established building practices. February 10, 1899. The barometric pressure had been dropping steadily for 3 days, and experienced plainsmen recognized the atmospheric signs that preceded the kind of weather system that could kill livestock and strand families for weeks. Martha Henderson recorded, "The morning temperature at -8 degrees with winds building from the northwest, conditions that would have been considered severe under normal circumstances, but represented only the preliminary edge of what meteorologists would later document as one of the most extreme cold outbreaks in American frontier history. The storm system that swept down from the Canadian prairies carried Arctic air that had been building strength across thousands of miles of frozen wilderness. Unlike the typical winter storms that brought snow and wind, but temperatures that rarely dropped below -20 for extended periods, this outbreak would drive the mercury toward -30 and hold it there for days. Frontier settlements that had survived previous harsh winters would face conditions that tested the absolute limits of their building techniques, fuel supplies, and survival knowledge. Samuel Wright had spent the previous week making emergency rounds through the township, checking cabin construction, and advising families to increase their wood stockpiles beyond normal winter requirements. His standard recommendations focused on the fundamentals that had kept frontier families alive through previous cold snaps. Seal every gap in the walls, bank the exterior with sod or snow for additional insulation, maintain constant fires, and prepare for fuel consumption that could triple during extreme weather. Wright's advice represented the accumulated wisdom of multiple generations of plain settlers who had learned through deadly trial and error which techniques separated survival from catastrophe. The first night of the deep freeze revealed the limitations of conventional frontier heating methods with devastating clarity. Cabins built according to established practices struggled to maintain interior temperatures above the freezing point, despite continuous fires that consumed wood at rates no family could sustain for more than a few days. The standard approach of fighting cold with fuel worked adequately during moderate weather, but became economically and physically impossible when outside temperatures dropped below -25 and wind drove cold through every microscopic gap in log walls that had seemed tight during milder conditions. Wright's own cabin, constructed with meticulous attention to traditional techniques, experienced the same thermal failures that plagued every conventional structure in the district. Ice formed in the interior corners where two outside walls met, creating frost patterns that revealed heat loss, despite his best efforts at chinking and weather sealing. The single-wall log construction that provided adequate insulation during normal winter conditions became a thermal bridge that conducted exterior cold directly into the living space, overwhelming his heating system's capacity to maintain comfort. The wood consumption rates during the coldest nights approached levels that threatened to exhaust fuel supplies that had been calculated for an entire winter season. Wright burned through 55 pounds of split hardwood during each 12-hour period of darkness, feeding his stove every 2 hours to prevent the fire from banking too low to generate adequate heat. The physical labor of maintaining such intensive heating schedules while fighting hypothermia-inducing cold created a feedback loop where families expended dangerous amounts of energy just to gather and split the fuel needed to stay alive through another night. Interior temperatures in conventionally heated cabins dropped to levels that posed immediate health risks to vulnerable family members. Wright's thermometer, mounted 4 feet above the floor and away from direct stove heat, registered 38 degrees at dawn after nights when he had maintained continuous fires. The floor level, where children slept and cold air naturally accumulated, measured several degrees lower, temperatures that approached the threshold where prolonged exposure could cause hypothermia even in individuals wearing multiple layers of wool clothing and wrapped in heavy blankets. The Hartwell family, recent arrivals from Ohio, who occupied a cabin 2 miles east of Wright's homestead, faced conditions that exceeded their limited frontier experience and threatened to overwhelm their heating capacity entirely. Their cabin, built during the autumn construction rush, when speed took precedence over thermal efficiency, developed interior frost accumulations that began forming 3 feet from their fireplace, clear evidence that their heating system could not overcome the heat loss through inadequately sealed walls and a roof that lacked sufficient insulation to prevent radiant cooling. Young Timothy Hartwell developed the harsh, persistent cough that frontier parents recognized as the first symptom of serious respiratory distress caused by prolonged exposure to cold conditions. His mother, Sarah, noticed that their water bucket had developed a skin of ice during the night, despite being placed within 6 feet of their fire, a sign that interior temperatures were approaching levels that made normal domestic activities impossible and basic survival increasingly difficult with each passing hour of extreme weather. The community's collective fuel supplies, calculated based on previous winter consumption patterns, proved inadequate for the sustained high-intensity heating required during the prolonged cold outbreak. Families that had stockpiled 4 to 5 cords of wood, amounts that normally provided comfortable heating through entire winter seasons, found themselves burning through weekly fuel allowances in 2 to 3 days. The mathematics of survival became stark and immediate as settlers realized that conventional heating methods could not be sustained at the consumption rates required to maintain livable interior conditions. Emergency measures that had worked during previous cold snaps failed to provide adequate relief from the life-threatening conditions. Banking cabins with additional snow provided marginal insulation improvements, but could not overcome the fundamental thermal bridging problems created by single-wall log construction. Hanging blankets and canvas sheets to create smaller heated spaces within cabins reduced the volume that needed to be warmed, but could not eliminate the heat loss through exterior walls that had become conduits for deadly cold. The social structure of the frontier community began showing signs of strain as individual families confronted the possibility that their fuel supplies might not last through the extended cold period. Neighbors who normally shared resources and labor found themselves calculating whether they could afford to help others without compromising their own family's survival. The collective confidence in established building and heating practices eroded as evidence mounted that conventional techniques were insufficient for conditions that fell outside the range of previous experience. Martha Henderson's careful temperature records documented the failure of traditional methods with scientific precision that removed any ambiguity about the severity of the crisis. Her measurements showed interior temperatures in multiple conventional cabins dropping below 40 degrees despite continuous fires and emergency fuel consumption that could not be sustained for more than a few additional days without depleting winter wood supplies entirely. Martha Henderson approached the 2 cabins with the methodical precision that had made her the most trusted record keeper in the township. She carried identical mercury thermometers in padded cases, instruments she had ordered from a medical supply catalog in Chicago, specifically for documenting weather patterns and temperature variations. The Great Arctic outbreak of February 1899 had driven temperatures across the northern plains to levels that defied previous experience, wind chills approaching minus 100 degrees, with sustained air temperatures dropping below minus 40 degrees for multiple consecutive days. This was the test that would determine whether Lars Anderson's blackened wall represented genuine innovation or dangerous foolishness. The temperature readings she recorded at pre-dawn on February 14th would become the definitive measurement that settled months of community debate about the Norwegian immigrants' heating method. Henderson positioned herself at the midpoint of each cabin's interior, hanging her thermometers 4 feet above the floor and 6 feet away from direct stove heat to ensure comparable readings. The instruments had been calibrated against each other the previous week, eliminating any variation that could compromise the accuracy of her comparative data. Inside Samuel Wright's cabin, built according to established frontier standards with single-wall log construction and conventional heating methods, the mercury showed 38 degrees Fahrenheit at the coldest point of the night. Wright had maintained continuous fires throughout the crisis, burning through his carefully calculated fuel reserves at rates that would exhaust his winter woodpile within days if the extreme cold persisted. Ice had formed in the interior corners where 2 exterior walls met, creating frost patterns that revealed heat loss despite his meticulous attention to chinking and weather sealing during the autumn preparation period. The comparison reading from Lars Anderson's cabin delivered results that challenged everything Wright and his neighbors understood about frontier heating efficiency. Henderson's thermometer registered 59 degrees, a difference of 21 degrees that represented the gap between dangerous cold and sustainable comfort during life-threatening weather conditions. The charred south wall had absorbed enough solar energy during the brief sunny periods between storm systems to create a thermal mass that continued radiating stored heat throughout the extended hours of darkness. The mechanism that produced this dramatic temperature advantage operated through principles that any experienced builder could understand once the technique was demonstrated. During daylight hours when the sun appeared between storm clouds, the blackened surface absorbed radiant energy that light-colored wood would have reflected back toward the sky. The thick log construction stored this captured heat within the timber itself, creating a thermal battery that released warmth gradually into the cabin interior for hours after sunset. The effect was most pronounced during clear periods, but even diffuse light filtering through overcast skies provided measurable energy input to the darkened surface. Wright's fuel consumption during the crisis had reached levels that threatened to exhaust his winter wood supply before March, forcing him to burn 55 pounds of split timber each night to maintain interior temperatures that still dropped toward the freezing point. Anderson's heating requirements remained within sustainable ranges, approximately 35 pounds per night, while achieving interior conditions that eliminated the risk of hypothermia for sleeping family members. The difference represented more than convenience. It meant the gap between survival and catastrophe during extended periods of extreme weather. The thermal performance gap extended beyond simple temperature measurements to practical advantages that improved both comfort and safety throughout the coldest nights. Anderson could set his stove damper to lower settings 45 minutes earlier each evening, extending the intervals between required stoking from 2 hours to 3 hours. This reduction in nighttime maintenance allowed for longer periods of uninterrupted sleep, preventing the exhaustion that accumulated when family members took turns maintaining fires through 20-hour periods of darkness. The saved labor proved as valuable as the saved fuel during weather conditions that demanded maximum physical reserves for basic survival tasks. The charred wall technique also demonstrated secondary benefits that became apparent during the extended cold outbreak. The tallow-sealed surface showed improved resistance to moisture infiltration, reducing the frost buildup that plagued conventional log walls when interior humidity condensed against cold exterior surfaces. The treated wood exhibited fewer expansion and contraction gaps, maintaining tighter seals between logs and reducing the draft problems that undermined heating efficiency in standard construction. These advantages accumulated over time, making the thermal benefits more pronounced as the severe weather continued. Henderson's documentation revealed that the temperature differential remained consistent across multiple measurement periods, confirming that the results represented genuine thermal performance rather than temporary effects or measurement error. Readings taken at dawn, midday, and evening showed the charred wall cabin maintaining its 21-degree advantage throughout the diurnal cycle. Even during overcast periods when solar input was minimal, the stored heat within the treated logs continued providing measurable warmth that conventional walls could not match. The social dynamics within the township began shifting as word spread about Henderson's documented temperature measurements. Neighbors who had openly mocked the blackened wall technique found themselves questioning whether their loyalty to conventional methods was based on sound reasoning or simply resistance to change. The mathematical clarity of the 21-degree difference removed ambiguity from debates that had previously relied on subjective impressions and untested assumptions about proper building practices. Wright himself experienced the most significant change in perspective, visiting Anderson's cabin during the peak of the cold outbreak to verify Henderson's measurements with his own instruments. The veteran carpenter spent an hour examining the charred surface, testing its temperature with his bare hand and studying the construction details that made the technique effective. His professional pride had been challenged by the evidence that an immigrant newcomer had discovered a heating method superior to established American frontier practices. But his practical nature recognized the value of techniques that could save lives during extreme weather events. The immediate vindication of Anderson's method created a demand for instruction that extended beyond simple curiosity to urgent necessity. Families whose fuel supplies were approaching dangerous depletion sought advice about modifying their cabins to capture solar energy, even though the process would require controlled fire during conditions when any mistake could prove catastrophic. The desperation created by the unprecedented cold outbreak overcame conservative reluctance to experiment with building modifications during winter months. Young Timothy Hartwell's persistent cough had worsened to the point where his parents recognized the symptoms of serious respiratory distress caused by prolonged exposure to interior temperatures that approached dangerous levels. Sarah Hartwell approached Anderson directly, requesting shelter for her family during the coldest nights, rather than continuing to risk her children's health in a cabin that could not maintain adequate warmth despite continuous fires. The request represented a practical acknowledgement that conventional methods had failed when tested by weather conditions that exceeded their design parameters, forcing families to seek alternative solutions or risk permanent harm to vulnerable members. The Hartwell family arrived at Lars Anderson's cabin after dark on February 15th, carrying wool blankets and what remained of their dwindling food supplies. Sarah Hartwell's face showed the strain of 3 sleepless nights spent tending fires that could not adequately warm a cabin where her youngest child had developed the kind of deep, rattling cough that frontier parents learned to fear. Timothy's condition had deteriorated beyond what could be safely managed in their own dwelling, where interior temperatures dropped below 40 degrees despite burning through wood reserves at unsustainable rates. Anderson directed the family toward the warmest section of his cabin, the corner adjacent to the charred south wall where radiant heat from the treated logs created a pocket of comfort that remained consistently above 60 degrees throughout the night. The positioning was deliberate, utilizing the thermal mass effect that made the blackened surface function as a slow-release heater during the hours when conventional stoves struggled to maintain adequate output. Timothy's breathing showed immediate improvement within the warmer environment, demonstrating the direct relationship between interior temperature and respiratory health during extreme cold conditions. The overnight refuge provided Anderson with an opportunity to demonstrate the practical application of his heating method to neighbors who had previously dismissed it as foreign superstition. He explained the technique with the methodical precision of a tradesman passing knowledge to apprentices, beginning with site preparation that eliminated fire hazards and progressing through the controlled charring process that transformed reflective wood surfaces into solar energy collectors. The instruction covered every detail necessary for safe implementation, from flame control techniques to the tallow sealing that protected the carbon layer from weather damage. The charring process required specific conditions and careful attention to prevent the controlled burn from escalating into structural fire. Anderson emphasized the importance of clearing combustible materials from a 10-foot radius around the work area and maintaining water supplies adequate for emergency suppression. The technique worked best during calm weather when flame direction could be precisely controlled, making autumn the ideal season for treatment when fire danger was reduced, but enough time remained before winter to assess the thermal performance of the modified surface. Samuel Wright arrived the following morning without announcement, carrying his own thermometer and a notebook where he recorded temperature measurements that confirmed Henderson's previous documentation. The veteran carpenter examined the charred wall surface with professional thoroughness, testing its structural integrity and studying the tallow finish that had preserved the carbon layer through multiple freeze-thaw cycles. Wright's conversion from skeptic to advocate represented a significant shift in community opinion, legitimizing the technique through the endorsement of the township's most respected building authority. The instruction Wright received covered the maintenance requirements that would preserve the thermal benefits over multiple winter seasons. The charred surface needed periodic renewal every 2 to 3 years, depending on weather exposure and the quality of the original application. The tallow sealing required annual inspection and touch-up applications, particularly on surfaces that received direct precipitation. These maintenance tasks represented manageable commitments that fit within normal homestead work schedules while providing heating advantages that could reduce fuel requirements by 20 to 30% during clear winter weather. Community adoption of the technique began immediately, despite the challenges of implementing building modifications during winter conditions. 3 neighboring families undertook careful charring of their south-facing walls within the week following Wright's endorsement, working during brief periods when wind conditions permitted safe fire management. The results varied depending on execution quality and wall orientation, but every properly treated surface showed measurable temperature improvements that reduced heating costs and improved interior comfort during subsequent cold periods. The broader implications of the technique extended beyond individual heating efficiency to fundamental changes in how frontier builders approached passive solar design. Cabins constructed after the 1899 outbreak incorporated south wall orientation as a primary consideration, with builders positioning windows and doors to maximize winter sun exposure while minimizing north-facing openings that created heat loss. These modifications represented the beginning of systematic attention to building orientation that would eventually evolve into comprehensive passive heating strategies. Martha Henderson documented the community transformation in detailed correspondence with relatives in Minnesota and Wisconsin, describing how a single Norwegian immigrant's knowledge had changed local building practices within months of its demonstration. Her letters included temperature measurements and fuel consumption data that provided quantitative evidence of the technique's effectiveness, information that spread the method to other frontier communities facing similar heating challenges during harsh northern winters. The economic impact of reduced fuel consumption proved significant enough to influence sawmill operations and firewood suppliers throughout the region. Families that had previously purchased additional cordwood to survive extreme weather found their existing supplies adequate when supplemented by solar heat gain from treated walls. The reduced demand affected local timber markets, demonstrating how individual building improvements could create measurable changes in regional commerce and resource allocation patterns. Long-term adoption of the charring technique required adaptation to local conditions and available materials that varied across different frontier regions. Communities with abundant pine supplies could replicate Anderson's exact method, while areas with different timber types needed modifications to achieve similar results. Some builders experimented with tar applications instead of tallow sealing, while others developed techniques for treating log surfaces with controlled burns that used different fuel sources or flame management approaches. The technique's integration into established building practices occurred gradually as experienced carpenters like Wright incorporated solar heating principles into their standard construction methods. New cabins featured deliberate south wall positioning and reduced north-facing openings, while existing structures received modifications that improved their thermal performance without requiring complete reconstruction. These changes represented the practical adoption of passive heating concepts that had been proven effective through documented measurement and community observation. Anderson's role evolved from experimental innovator to recognized teacher as his method gained acceptance throughout the township and surrounding districts. He traveled to neighboring communities during the following autumn, demonstrating the charring technique and advising builders on implementation details that ensured safe and effective results. His instruction emphasized the importance of proper site preparation, controlled flame management, and protective sealing that would preserve thermal benefits through multiple winter seasons. The legacy of the technique extended far beyond its immediate heating advantages to establish principles of passive solar design that would influence frontier construction for decades. Buildings oriented to capture winter sun, walls designed to store and release thermal energy, and construction methods that minimized heat loss became standard considerations in regions where fuel efficiency determined survival during extreme weather conditions. On the frontier, the people who last are the ones who learn to use what the land gives, sun included, before they're forced to beg for it.